Everyday Samurai, Episode 1. Greetings, and welcome to Everyday Samurai, the podcast that is in service to individual liberty and securing a free state through the study of samurai martial systems, a victorious mindset, and the principles of political economy. We are all about personal empowerment and social contribution on this show, and we are building a world that truly works for everyone through the disciplines of situational awareness, personal readiness, and expanded consciousness. Does this sound like something worth striving for to you? Because we recognize that politics is always downstream of culture, our task is to spread the protector's ethic among a well-informed population of well-armed citizens. As daunting as this may sound, it remains a worthy endeavor, and a labor of love is one of the great riches of life. In other words, and borrowing from the great economist Friedrich Hayek, we are making the building of a free society once more an intellectual adventure and a deed of courage. To start things off, we are doing a deep dive into a fantastic and profound book that examines martial arts in search of the universal principles applicable to individuals, not only to protect themselves and their property, but also for the maintenance of justice, a truly civil society, and the proper administration of government. If this sounds like a lot of material to unpack, you are correct. As I said earlier, it really is a profound book, and we are going to cover it in detail. If you stick around, I'm sure you'll get a lot out of it too. The book we are talking about is called Igensho, the Book of Dignity, General Principles of Martial Art, and it was published in 2006. Yet packed into this relatively compact volume was the distillation of several decades worth of personal journal entries from an American that traveled the world on his own unique odyssey. To help you follow along, we've extracted an outline of the book and made it available to you at no cost. All you have to do is give us your email address and we'll give you a free PDF download. Just go to www.everydaysamurai.life/dignity. That's www.everydaysamurai.life/dignity. The author lived for a long time in Japan. He studied karate, aikido, and samurai swordsmanship, as well as other disciplines. Igensho was published under the pen name of Suzuki Kintaro, and he likes to keep a low profile. So, for our purposes, we'll just call him Jim. So Jim, welcome to Everyday Samurai.
Yes, sir. Good to be here.
So tell me a little bit about your pen name and why you chose it.
I lived for a time in the city of Kyoto on the Karasumadori, which is a north-south avenues in that city. It passes by the Kyoto Gosho, the ancient imperial palace grounds. I used to go out there in the morning and run around the perimeter. And so when I was looking around for a pen name, I found I liked with people's names, which you can find anywhere, but as much in Japan as anywhere else, is that people sometimes use place names as family names. For some reason or other, I always enamored of the graphic or symbolic image of ravens and crows and blackbirds and that sort of thing. Karasu means about bird. Kyoto Gosho is full of pine trees, and so there's always a large population of black birds or crows or whatever you want to call them, flying around in there and hollering. I learned years later that the raven is also associated with the Japanese royal family, which is associated with the sun. The second character in Karasuma is Maru, which means a circle or a disc. And so if you had a street, some American town or city with that name, it'd be Crow Circle or Raven Circle or something like that. I kind of like that. It was fairly easy to come up with that just because of where I lived. Kantaro being the given name, I looked around at a lot of possibilities for that. Finally, I was inspired to choose this name because it was kind of amusing. It was sort of a humorous thing. I had been reading an extraordinary historical book which came out in the early 70s. It's called Japan's Imperial Conspiracy by David Bergamini. Anyone is interested in the history of the imperial family and its activities relating to Japanese imperialism and World War II and so on. One of the most interesting things I've read. And so I was deeply engaged in reading this book, and there was one character who came up in the book from time to time in the first half of it, who was Admiral Suzuki Kintaro, who was not in on active duty, I believe, by the time of Pearl Harbor. He was a well-known naval staff officer. Eventually became the prime minister of Japan at one point. His is a very strong name.
In either case, it comes from a very noble lineage. So the Karasu is associated with the royal family, and then Kantaro is associated with an admiral.
Yeah, it's the verb tsuranuku is what it is, which means thrusting as with a spear. Taro is a typical ending for the name of any male child, which usually refers to his being a good provider and stuff like that.
And true to Japanese society, it's natural for somebody to change their name several times throughout their lifetime.
Oh, yeah. I wanted a name that was very easy to remember, had a distinctive image and rhythm, but also something that was an ordinary, relatively ordinary sounding, typical sounding Japanese name, rather than some sort of transliteration of an American name, which is what a lot of people do. So every time this fellow came up in the history book I was reading, he was always referred to by the author as the cigar-smoking Suzuki Kintaro. I just found that very amusing because almost nobody in Japan has ever smoked cigars, just a very, very few people. And so the image of the cigar-smoking Suzuki Kintaro was very amusing. So I chose that name sort of as a joke.
Then let's jump into the book itself, because it certainly left quite a bit of an impression on a number of different people. I think the most notable is Joe Hyam, who wrote Zen in the Martial Arts, and he gave a very glowing review, and quite a number of other people, including folks involved in law enforcement and the military, wrote excellent blurbs to put in the front of the book. And it, I guess, can only attest to the great wisdom that's in such a very compact and readable book. What was your motivation for writing it?
I started training in the state in 1970, I suppose. I'd been messing around with things for years before that, but I started training at under formal conditions at a school back about 1970, and this was a Taekwondo dojang, which, unlike the stuff that goes under that heading today, was hardcore martial art. There was no concern about competition or showmanship or any of that stuff. The master instructor there was a man called Sun Dok-sung, who had been, as I understand, the chief hand-to-hand combat instructor for the South Korean Army during the Korean War era. He also had been a professional boxer at some point in his life, and he was just totally hardcore. His explanation of the purpose of Taekwondo was to kill people. That's it. If you put it in sort of more recent jargon, that I don't know if they're still using this little phrase in the military, but to kill people and break things. He was a lovely man, but this was the spirit of close combat that he taught. He was concerned only with the simplest and most efficient ways of training people to do this kind of thing. In 1973, I ended up going to Japan for training because I wanted, having done a good deal of training in this man's dojo, or before his gate, as they like to say in Asia, I wanted to learn a little bit more about the form and the culture and philosophy and the religious aspects and all the rest of it. And I had encountered a gentleman who was a Japanese, how do I put this? He was a guy who quit the Japanese corporate community, who hugely successful engineer and inventor, who came to America looking for some kind of recognition and remuneration for his work, which all went to the corporation that he worked for at the time, and he got tired of that. And he came over here, and he was working two jobs, one at a little Japanese restaurant and a little Japanese bookstore. I met him while I was looking through some Japanese books on the subject of karate. He noticed me hanging out over there, and there were almost never any Americans in this little Japanese bookstore because there was no English language stuff there. It was all in Japanese. I didn't speak any Japanese, or certainly not read it, but I was just looking at the pictures. So he introduced himself, and there's a lot of stuff that comes out of that, but he was my first teacher of the Japanese karate, which was at that time Zen Nippon Karate Kyokai, the JKA, or so-called Shotokan system, which utilized the same basic drills as the Korean Taekwondo system and so on. So I began to be exposed to Japanese culture here in America, his little community of Japanese expatriates, and I began to get used to the sound and the rhythm of Japanese language, the various postures and gestures and all that sort of thing. And so I ended up kind of being influenced by these folks to go and train in Japan. In 1973, I started keeping a journal of my experiences over there. And I kept that up until, I guess, 1987 or so, when I came back home. I had just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of notes. And at one point, I decided to just go through them all and try to see if I could make any sense out of it all. So I started collating and editing and rewriting stuff and trying to come up with some kind of a coherent piece of work to reflect what I had learned in my training, which included not only dojo time, but just time in country, learning the culture and the language and all that sort of thing.
But it was also, if I could mention what you write in the foreword, which is an attempt to clarify the fundamental, universal, perennial nature of martial arts. So you were looking for something that could be applied everywhere to everyone. And I guess what you took was a distillation of those notes and put it into a condensed volume in the hopes of making it universal.
By the time I started working at this project, I had trained in a number of different methods and different skill sets. I had no training partners at that point. When I had come back to America, I was looking around for a good place to train, and I was having some trouble finding it. So I was just trying to maintain my own skill level, if you can call it that, by just doing a lot of solo training, which involved a lot of what the Japanese people call kata, which is to say formal drills that can be done with or without a training partner. I had accumulated so many drills from different methods of karate and the sword and the jo, the short staff. I had also begun studying some Pinoy or Filipino stick and knife methods and so on. That I discovered that if I started at, say, 11 o'clock in the morning, I'd still be at it 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening, and it took that long to go through all the drill. There were just too damn many of them, and I noticed that maybe 50% or so was redundant. All the fundamental movements in all the different systems and methods were fundamentally the same, except that they were stylistically varied.
That's where you write also in the foreword about you don't have to do any further study of esoteric cultural factors once you understand the fundamental principles.
Yeah, and again, all of this stuff we're talking about a 50-year period, so it's hard to really boil it down too simple a model, but that's what I was after. I was looking at a very extensive range of experience and information and stuff that I began to understand that the underlying principles driving all the different methods from all the different countries, all the different periods of history, all the different social classes and what have you, seemed to be just that. That's what came to be my fundamental measure or metric of value in any field of inquiry, is that which is fundamental, universal, and perennial. And that sort of became the standard by which I was trying to understand the common underlying principles that drive not only all martial arts, but all athletics, all physical labor, everything that has to do with utilizing the human body to perform systematic skills organized into skill set and applicable to any fundamental problem, which can be found pretty much anywhere at any time.
Let me jump in a second to tell you about shop.everydaysamurai.life. If you're interested in personal security and readiness, you've probably got some tools that go into your everyday carry. Hopefully, this includes a tactical pen, because when you're legislatively or otherwise situationally unable to carry the best tools for the job, your last resort might just be a tactical pen. Having the right one could just be the deciding factor in a crisis. At shop.everydaysamurai.life, we've got an assortment of tactical pens ideally suited for strength and power when you need it most. The samurai of old followed what is known in Japanese as bunbu ryodo, sword and brush, or the dual path of scholarly and martial arts. A tactical pen means you've always got options. Plus, we're putting the finishing touches on a basic employment guide that will be yours as a bonus, absolutely free, when you purchase any EDC pen from our site. So check out shop.everydaysamurai.life today. Pick up a tactical pen, a first aid kit, or even some samurai-themed accessories. That's shop.everydaysamurai.life. And that's kind of where you're taking it to the next level, because you recognize that throughout history, the martial arts have been the domain of the aristocratic elite and used from a position of authority mostly to secure that position and to prevent any other takers from occupying that position. And what you've done is look at these principles not only at the individual level, but also at the social level, whereby indeed martial art becomes something more than just force on force, but a means of securing dignity for the individual and propriety for the entire society. So at what point did you start looking at martial art not necessarily as physical skill, but also a means of bringing propriety into the community?
That arose in my mind during this very long and involved process was the fundamental question: what is martial art? It's unusual when we utilize a term of language whereby most of us have a whole range of unconscious assumptions associated with that term, and we think we know what it means, and we bandy it back and forth between us, and we mostly have a pretty fair idea of what we mean, what the other guy means. But as often as not, the use of these various terms, which are legion throughout any language, are not accurate, and they're deeply distorted over time until they come to have absolutely nothing to do with their original meaning. We can see this constantly with the interpretation and construction of Constitution, for example, in our own society right up to the present day. What do the words mean? What did they mean to the people who wrote them? So martial art in the English language has one origin, in the Japanese language it has another origin, and on the surface, when we look at the so-called art of war or the art of strategy or some of the various terms that are used, all of which are quite relevant, but largely misleading, particularly because the field is absolutely enormous and it involves 10,000 years of history, both sort of excavated and recorded. Clearly, if you're looking at it from a grunt's eye view on the ground, you're not too concerned about all these things. You've got a man out there at 100 yards trying to blow your head off. Your objective is to prevent that from happening, if possible, to fulfill whatever mission you've been assigned. And so you're basically concerned with the problem of killing people and breaking things. That's as far as it goes with most people, particularly those who have had really important experience on the ground and who are convinced by deep feral emotion that's associated with this kind of experience that they know exactly what they're talking about, and really nobody else can be expected to know because they haven't been there. And there's truth in that. But there's a lot more to it than that, because the people who are deploying them, who are training them, who are paying them and equipping them and all the rest of it have a whole range of different stuff that drives their activities.
And that's what you're talking about with this general codex of basic principles as a convenient mechanism to organize and transmit knowledge.
Yeah, which is, for example, if you're looking at the Japanese language, there's the term ju or juha. You've got a Japanese reading and a Chinese reading for every Japanese word or every Chinese character. The so-called onyomi, the Chinese reading, its original reading as understood by the Japanese, and it's kunyomi, which is the Japanese usage of that reading in combination with other characters and kana writing systems and all the rest of it. That word ryu refers to a current, as a current of air, a current of water, a current of electricity, a flow.
The alternate reading being nagare.
Nagare, which means also a flow. The various verb forms to flow, to flush, to wash away.
And also meaning lineage.
Well, the flow of information, the flow of knowledge, the flow of authority, the flow of tradition from one person to another, from one generation to the next, which is why it's important, particularly in an age when there was no recording equipment and everything had to be replicated exactly according to a certain standard that had to be maintained in order to ensure accurate transmission from one generation to the next. And then the Juha, which is the particular group of people who are undertaking to acquire these skill sets, to utilize them for whatever purposes, and to transmit them to the next generation.
Well, we're talking about the principles being universal and applicable to every individual at the individual level, but then also within society at large.
Yeah, so you got probably four basic paradigms of governance or social organization or political organization throughout human history, which begins with the level of tribalism and which advances eventually through political and social economic dispositions into a condition of feudalism, which is the origin of many of these ancient arts, not only in Asia but in Europe and elsewhere around the world. And then you have, in the post-industrial revolutionary era, the modern forms of totalitarianism.
When you say totalitarianism, you're talking about Soviet Russia, Maoist China, and the various welfare states.
Yeah, any form of tyranny which involves total social, political, and economic control of a population by the state, almost invariably through the use of power. We have just one major exception that we can find in the whole history of the world to this fundamental, universal, perennial paradigm of governance, which is tyranny, and that is the American Revolution. It is revolutionary because it is the first and still, I believe, the only paradigm of governance which is first conceived and designed by philosophers to repudiate the paradigm of tyranny and to replace it with one of just and proper self-governance by and for individual persons. All of this being based on the original European Enlightenment concept of individual rights. And the world has always been divided along various lines, but since probably the late 17th century, with the origins of the Enlightenment in Great Britain and in Holland and in Switzerland and elsewhere in Europe, we begin to see gradually a trend toward individual rights, and with the publication of The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith in 1776, which is an interesting date to correlate with the birth of the United States.
And all the antecedents that went into, we're talking David Hume and all the others.
Yeah, John Locke, et cetera, et cetera. And the evolution of the British or the English common law, and there's a wide range of things that factors are involved here, all of which lead to the American Revolution, which ought not to be confused with the War of Independence.
What exactly do you mean in the distinction between those two?
The American colonists, largely of British descent, but also including people from many other nations around the world, decided for reasons that they explain very thoroughly in their various publications and documents, decided that it was time for them to dissolve what does it say in the Declaration of the
bonds.
Political bonds that connect them. The British who had contributed a great deal to occupying and settling this continent, who expected to derive the benefits of it, and certainly had every right to expect that. But unfortunately, they were not willing to suffer the equal representation in Parliament, and therefore could not participate actively in the policies and the laws that governed their lives. So for many years, guys like Benjamin Franklin, for 20, 25 years, was in London advocating for equal representation in Parliament of the various American colonies, and the British were not sympathetic to this view. There was a lot of other stuff having to do with currency manipulation and all kinds of stuff.
Listed as the long train of abuses, I should say.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. They attempted to negotiate, they attempted to remonstrate, they attempted to appeal in many different ways. They exhausted, or they believed that they had exhausted, all the various peaceful and legal means of redress of the various grievances that they felt they had, most of which would have been expressed by them at the time as being violations of Magna Carta, which was the 13th century document that brought kings and queens of England under the same law that governed the aristocracy. It was one very important step toward the idea of individual rights and the rule of law. Now, we could talk about that for 2 weeks, but it starts there, and there's other developed in Europe and so on. But eventually, the founders of this nation, who all were very erudite students of world history and European history and politics and economics, and many of whom were fluent or at least literate in Latin and Greek and Hebrew and what was the contemporaneous or modern language in their time of French and German and Dutch and so on. These gentlemen derived what they believed to be the fundamental, universal, perennial principles of justice.
Friends, if you are at all interested in Japan, the samurai, or Japanese martial arts of any kind, it is essential that you learn at least the basics of the language. That's right. You must study Japanese to have credibility in samurai-related martial arts. I can't tell you how embarrassing it is to see foreigners in Japan wandering around lost, having awkward conversations with training partners as they murder some pronunciation, or looking really confused when their teachers are talking to them. At least set a personal goal to learn the proper pronunciation for the terms in your art. Learn to say the names of the techniques correctly and be able to interact a little with the Japanese people you'll inevitably run into. Right now, there's no excuse, because when you sign up through my special link, you'll get a free 14-day trial to Rocket Languages. Just go to everydaysamurai.life/rocket to access interactive audio, culture notes, voice recognition technology to check your pronunciation, writing lessons so you can read the road signs or find a ramen shop when you need one. We're talking about 128 hours of lesson time and a downloadable app to take it all on the go with you. You can learn Japanese on your commute. It's never been easier. All this free for 2 full weeks when you go to www.everydaysamurai.life/rocket. That's everydaysamurai.life/rocket. Which is why they could say that they hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, and all these things, that they were also looking for a universal right and a universal source of law and a universal ethic to implement that law.
Yeah, and of course this sort of thing was clearly stated by John Locke, and the American Enlightenment, as in so many other cases, was a product of the European Enlightenment. It wasn't invented here. It wasn't invented by the founding fathers. But what they did was to refine it, to organize or systematize the philosophy associated with it, and to design, in the words of the extraordinary Newt Gingrich, to design a government that was so inefficient that no tyrant could ever make it work.
What a legacy. I mean, when we talk about the Ryuha in the Japanese system and that lineage, and of course, as you rightly indicated, the Magna Carta seems to be the landmark document that started a 700-year march towards liberty, and it culminating in that Declaration of Independence and the War for Independence that actually put those principles into operation in a brand new way. Never been tried before, hasn't been tried since. It is indeed that lineage that came to fruition because of the people that were willing to cultivate it over time, to refine it, to systematize it, and then to put it into operation in such a unique way that we in the United States inherited. I mean, it seems to be that there is that lineage that we need to also recognize at work.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, in my view, as a direct result of an extraordinarily pernicious, there's no other word for it, conspiracy on the part of a large group of people with many variations in their fundamental views, but who we might call collectivists, we might call communists or fascists.
Socialists of all stripes.
Advocates of, the divine right of kings and emperors and all that sort of thing. Also, those who would exercise tyranny. And this, by the way, is, in my view, the proper delineation between right and left-wing political philosophy or ideology. We are taught by the left-wing thinkers who have infiltrated and completely come to dominate the American and virtually the whole global educational system. We're taught to believe that Democrats, for example, are on the left and Republicans are on the right, or that the Soviets were on the left and Nazis were on the right. This is all a lot of nonsense. It's all deception. It's smoke and mirrors.
It's also divide and rule.
Well, that is the fundamental strategy which is used by all tyrants of whatever stripe. And without getting into the extremely complex and detailed mountain of red herring distinctions between one ideology and another, if we look at what is fundamental, universal, and perennial, we find that all tyrants are identical. It doesn't matter if they are on the left, which would indicate that they were collectivist in their thinking, or if they are on the right, which would indicate that they are people who abuse power in the name of God. It doesn't matter what their stripe or ideology may be. There is one fundamental, universal, and perennial characteristic, which is the quintessence of tyrannical thinking and governance, and that is an utter contempt for the individual rights of human beings. It doesn't matter if you're a communist or a Nazi, if you're an Islamist or a Japanese militarist. All tyrannical governments, all tyrannical ideologies, all tyrants, all of their individual supporters and advocates share this common characteristic: absolute contempt for the individual rights of human beings.
I know you're familiar with Judge Andrew Napolitano.
Oh, yes.
And if you've ever heard him speak, he frequently makes reference to libido dominandi. And he always says, as the joke, not that kind of libido. Libido dominandi is the lust to dominate.
Yep.
The
lust for power.
The need for power and to power over others. And that seems to be the common characteristic of tyranny that is perennial. And therefore, your book goes long into describing why it's necessary not only for the individual to develop their own martial skills and understand their identity, but also understand their place within society and how participating in that society in terms of how it organizes for the administration of justice is so necessary to, quote the founders, the security of a free state. And I just want to finish with why it's necessary for he who wishes for peace must prepare for war.
Well, that is also an ancient axiom applied by tyrants as well. However, it's true nonetheless, in my view.
Well, let's clarify, because yes, of course, the tyrant will say whoever wishes for peace must prepare for war. But when we're looking at it from your perspective, it's universal. Therefore, it's applicable to the individual, but it's also a necessary component for the individual to contribute to the maintenance of a free society.
Okay, so that's the American view, and that's my view. But this American Enlightenment from the European Enlightenment, or from earlier attempts at just and proper governance in the Roman Republic or the Greek Republic, there is no case in history that I am aware of, or anywhere in the world today, where the fundamental founding document, which constitute by their own definition the supreme law of the land, empower the civilian citizenry to have armed authority over the state if its exercise should be necessary, to limit the power of the state if necessary by the just and proper use of force. We've had already 2 civil wars in this country, the first of which was the War of Independence, which was a civil war amongst subjects of the British Crown, because there was no United States at that time. This was a dispute amongst Englishmen for the rights of Englishmen as laid down in Magna Carta, which gave us the United States of America as a sovereign nation with a sovereign people in control of its own government, not the reverse.
And that was the unique contribution. And with that, I'm going to call it, and I think we've gone into some very intriguing territory, and I certainly know that everybody listening to this will want to tune in for episode 2 as we go into even more of what this wonderful book, Igensho, the Book of Dignity, General Principles of Martial Art, has to offer to us today. Thanks for your time today, Jim.
Thank you, sir. Enjoyed it.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Everyday Samurai, and look forward to seeing you next time. Be sure to subscribe to our feed so you don't miss an episode. If you like what you've heard here, give us a thumbs up or a 5-star review. Remember, the free PDF outline of Igensho, the Book of Dignity, is available free at www.everydaysamurai.life/dignity. Until next time, stay sharp, stay aware, and be well.